Oral or sublingual medications are convenient. They're easy to administer. The patients find them much more acceptable than injections in most cases. And there's a lot of options available. There's quite a number of medications that are out there. Ultimately, they will all work. And if the patient is already familiar with one of them or taking one of them, then it's a good strategy to just start with a medication that we know works for the patient and to go with that. And those medications are generally going to be available orally. The disadvantages of the oral or sublingual medications is that none of the oral versions of these have been specifically approved by the FDA for acute agitation, which means they haven't all been systematically studied. Now, that doesn't mean they don't work. There are some other studies on some of them, but there's just not as much information that's available out there. They also require patient cooperation. The patient has to be willing to say they're going to accept the medication and actually do it. And it's difficult to verify whether the patient has complied with the medication. Even equally important is that with the oral and sublingual medications, the time to onset is slower and the time to peak concentration is slower. There are several of the antipsychotic medications that are available in orally disintegrating tablets. This requires a lower level of cooperation, and it's difficult to cheek or discard the medication. The amount of time that it takes for these medications to dissolve is somewhat different among them. The fastest dissolving of them dissolves almost completely within about 3 to 5 seconds, and if you simply flick the medication, patients willing to open their mouth have to be cooperative to that degree, but you flick the medication into their mouth and it hits the oral mucosa. There's usually enough saliva there that by the time they get their tongue around to locate the medicine, it's already well on its way to dissolving. Some of them take a little bit longer, 10 to 15 seconds, and so there is time for the patient to fiddle with the medication. But in general, you can be fairly assured that the medication is going to go where it's supposed to go. The things to be aware of, though, with orally disintegrating medication is that they are not absorbed transmucosally. They have to be swallowed, just like any other medication, and they are not more rapid than standard oral formulations. There is no difference in those that dissolve in the mouth versus those that have to be swallowed as a pill in how long it takes them to get into the bloodstream. And it's important to keep those things in mind. Now, just one of the medications, Asenapine, is available as sublingual form. I mean, some of the benzodiazepines also. Among the antipsychotics, only that one. It has a more rapid onset and time to peak concentration than the oral medications, but ironically, it actually requires a higher level of patient cooperation than the standard pills do, because the pill has to be held under the tongue for quite some time before it fully is absorbed. And it's actually simpler for the patient to subvert this process by swallowing the medication because it's not absorbed in the GI tract. And so the sublingual medication may be appropriate in some situations, but probably not quite as good as the disintegrating tablets for ensuring that the medication actually get where it's supposed to go. As we think about oral medications, the first-line oral medications, starting with standard tablets, the first that I list here is Haloperidol. I list it as first-line not because I think it's more desirable than others, but it is simply the most common. It's readily available. We have lots of experience with it, and so it can be used. This version of it is not FDA approved for agitation, as I mentioned. The dose range is 2 to 5 milligrams per dose. For an acutely agitated patient, 5 milligrams is generally going to be the dose. The recommended frequency is every 6 hours. The average, 15 milligrams a day, is a pretty standard dose out in the community. Currently, the maximum recommended dose is about 30 milligrams a day, based on the probability of side effects and what we know about saturation of dopamine receptors. Not much is going to happen other than side effects above 30 milligrams a day. Time to peak concentration is about 2 hours. That's relatively quick by oral standards. And so this medication is still a viable option. We'll talk about specific advantages and disadvantages of these medications a little bit more subsequently. The orally disintegrating and sublingual tablets, listed alphabetically here, not as an endorsement of one over another, begins with Aripiprazole, which is an orally disintegrating tablet. The tablet is not FDA approved for agitation. The medication is, but the studies that looked at that were for the injectable version of the medicine. Usual dose range is 10 to 15 milligrams. Those are the only two sizes that these tablets come in. Can be given every 2 hours. And the average dose on this is about 20 milligrams a day. The maximum recommended dose, and this is very rarely violated, is 30 milligrams a day. Time to peak concentration is a bit slower. It's about 3 to 5 hours. So that may be okay in an agitated patient who's not terribly acute, but might be a little bit long in some other patients. Asenapine, the sublingual tablet that I mentioned earlier, is also not approved for agitation specifically. Dose range is either 5 or 10 milligrams twice a day, and the average dose is 10 milligrams a day. Maximum recommended 20 milligrams a day. This medicine is absorbed much more quickly, half an hour to 1 hour to peak concentration. And that, in this setting, would be its primary advantage. The rapid disintegrating Olanzapine. Olanzapine is a medication that is approved for acute agitation. Again, the studies that resulted in its approval involved an injectable form of Olanzapine rather than the tablets, but the medication itself has been studied. Dose range, either 5 or 10 milligrams per dose. And in terms of dose equivalence, 5 milligrams of this medicine is probably equivalent to about 3 milligrams of haloperidol. So 5 to 10 milligrams is roughly the same dose range as the haloperidol dosing. And it can be repeated at intervals from 30 minutes to 2 hours. The average dose is about 10 milligrams a day, and the maximum recommended dose is somewhere around 30 to 40 milligrams. This is higher than FDA approved. FDA approval is limited to 20 milligrams a day, but these doses are known to be safe, and you don't hit saturation of the dopamine receptors until you get somewhere into that 30 to 40 milligram a day range. The biggest issue with this medication is time to peak concentration, which is 5 to 6 hours. And so although the frequency with which doses can be given is fairly high, the time that it takes to get to a peak concentration is long. So one has to take care not to give too many repeated doses while the medicine is still being absorbed. And just waiting on this after each dose is given is often an effective strategy. Finally, Risperidone has a rapid disintegrating tablet, not FDA approved for agitation. Generally, 1 to 2 milligrams of this medication will be given. Again, this dose range, 1 to 2 milligrams, is about the same as 5 milligrams of haloperidol. May be given as often as every 30 minutes. The average dose, both in an acute state and for maintenance, is 4 milligrams a day. And we generally recommend not going higher than 6 to 8 milligrams a day, even though much higher doses are FDA approved. At 6 to 8 milligrams a day, the frequency of side effects rises pretty dramatically, and most of the benefit's going to be derived at these lower doses. This medicine takes about 3 hours to get to peak concentration. A large part of the activity of risperidone is through an active metabolite, and so the 3 hours to peak concentration includes that active metabolite. So the major points to keep in mind here: the orally disintegrating tablets are handy because they require a lower level of cooperation, and they're fairly acceptable to the patients, but it's important to remember that they're not more rapid than the standard oral formulations. That Aripiprazole, Olanzapine, and Risperidone are available in these disintegrating formulations. The sublingual formulation, which is absorbed most rapidly, still requires a higher level of cooperation really than any of the other medications in a dose range that can be given a couple of times a day and would be likely to act more rapidly.